So I'll just repeat to all those that I'll just wait. 3 other people are in the waiting room. In fact, I'll just repeat for the benefit of those that have just joined us. You'll see in the chat function a Menti address, and then on the screen in front of you a Menti poll that we're running. The reason we're doing this is it's a little bit of market research, essentially. We're keen to run more of these events. We feel there's both need and demand for them. You've kind of expressed both the demand for it. And so we're pitching for funding to help us run some of these. And just a little simple bit of market research will help us know what we should pitch for, and also illustrate to potential funders that, you know, we've engaged with people, this is what they were most interested in, and we're thinking of doing stuff around that. So if you can vote, I'd be grateful. So Dave, your torso, Dave.
Sorry?
We could only see your torso, Dave, in your head.
Right, I was just inputting my Menti
Excellent
questionnaire.
723.
Back now.
So we'll just give people another couple of minutes to join us. If I could just repeat the normal Zoom rules. If you're not muted already, and I see there are a few people that aren't muted, if you could mute yourselves, then I'd be grateful. Obviously, as we go through the event, then it would be great if we had a little bit more interaction, but just for the minute. So just for the benefit of anybody that's just joined us, if you could click on the Menti poll that's in the chat, then we can use that as a way of appraising demand for further training events and use that as evidence for a funding bid. A couple of folk, somebody's just joined us and isn't muted yet. If you could mute yourself, then I'd be grateful. All right. I see your question in the chat, Mark. Thank you. Not quite sure why that is, but feel free either to send in a separate email, put something in the chat. It's giving us a good indication of what people are after, which is excellent. So I think we're kind of, looks like the number of people is pretty stable, so we'll get going. Thanks ever so much for joining us. My name is Neville Elstone. I'm the Director of Cumbria Woodlands. We are recording this session, so please let us know if you object to that. I need to thank our sponsors, which is Forestry Commission England and Routes to Prosperity. If you do want a PDF of the presentation, then please contact us afterwards. So this is the third of 4 of these events which we're running. Kind of, we've gone, so far we've gone, well, you know, why should you do it? Then we've done, well, I need to get permission to do it. And today we're kind of doing, let's actually get on and do it. Let's have some big machines moving soil about and stuff. So that's pretty much what today's event is about. It's about identifying the right approach and trying to minimize the negative impact from that. Just to repeat, really, that this is a tutorial, really, rather than a training session. We're trying out that approach. So we're really happy to take questions. I'll ask Dave to do an introduction in a minute, and then after that we will take questions, open the floor up. If you want to ask a question, either use the chat. I think you can use, can we use Menti today, Claire, or just wave your arms and put yourself on, take yourself off mute. So I'll welcome Dave Atkinson again from Edwin Thompson in Carlisle. Thanks ever so much for joining us, Dave. Dave has extensive experience across the sector, which is why I'm really, really happy for him to join us and to run today's session. So I don't think I've missed anything else out, have I, Claire, Carrie? Please do keep me right. There's also a question in the chat that Carrie's just put up as well. So Claire, if I could ask you to remove the Menti poll and just let's full screen Dave, that would be brilliant. Thank you. Thanks ever so much for those results. They're really useful to us. With that, I'll hand over to Dave, who's going to give us an introduction to today's session, and then we'll move into the questions. So thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Neville, and good afternoon, everybody, again. So as Neville says, this week is very much about the nuts and bolts of ground preparation, about getting it done, and also looking at the Forestry Commission guidance, which I'm now reliably told is no longer draft guidance, but is the actual guidance that they will be using. So with that in mind, I think, well, actually, last week, I think I told you about what I did last Friday, and this week, I will tell you about what I did this Friday just gone, because it's actually given me a bit of an epiphany when it comes to ground preparation. So I'll come to that in a minute. But I was thinking about how best to sort of introduce and talk about this. And what I'll do is just talk about two examples of woodland creation projects that we undertook this time last year, or between Christmas last year and March. Now, the first one is a fairly straightforward project, farm woodland project in the Scottish borders, up near Bonchester Bridge. It's a fairly wet and sticky place, but good fertile farmland. And like all farmers, when they're doing farm woodland projects, they give you the worst land to plant. It was about 15 hectares, about a good block, what included a good block of about 8 hectares of spruce, a sizable native woodland block, and then some smaller extensions. I looked at it in the summer. It all looked nice and straightforward. Yes, it was rushy. I knew it was a little bit of a damp hollow in one of the areas, but fairly straightforward. And my intention was that with the native woodland, on some of the better drains there, we'd just direct plant that using 1.2 metre tree shelters as protection. On the wetter area where we're putting like an older birch mix, we were going to use inverted mound in there with an excavator, which gives a good sort of natural looking there and a good sound bit of ground preparation without really changing the soil too much. And then for the spruce, I wanted to use a plough. It was wet, sticky ground, fairly low lying, safe, there wasn't going to be any pollution issues, a bit of V drainage, and the job would be sorted. So that went fine. But what happens again with these things, all your best plans disappear, because we didn't get a grant contract until the end of December. So when we turned up with a bit of a rush, trying to get things done by the end of March, which is the deadline in Scotland, we turned up with a tractor and a plough, and we couldn't get it. We couldn't drive at all onto the site. The tractor would not go absolutely nowhere. So instantly, all our plans have gone, and we're sort of backpedaling. At which point we decide we're going to actually use an excavator, because it can actually travel on the ground, and we're going to do V drainage, ditch and dolloping. Now that's fine, it gives a good result. The excavator can reach out sort of 3 rows either side, so you've got a really nice intensive drainage network, which actually in hindsight is possibly even better than ploughing. But it instantly doubled the costs, and it made the job a bit slower. I've been back this summer, I've been back again this winter to get beaten up. Everything's good, establishment great, losses less than 10%, everything looking good. So again, but it's an interesting idea. Probably the message to take away from that is know your site in the winter as well as the summer. And that's not always easy for working in the private sector, where you're doing things quickly and often only get a chance to look at it 2 or 3 times before you make decisions. But sites do change, and they change dramatically in the winter. And you've got to think about the practicalities of actually getting machines on the ground. So that's one example of how to think about the problems and issues you're going to deal with. Now, back to my epiphany last week. And this relates to another site, which is about 12 hectares, and this is at Hexham. And it was on a rectangular field within a large woodland, always been grazed, sort of just like a piece of permanent pasture which has been grazed for whatever reason for probably the last 50 years. We got a client, bought the woodland and decided we'd plant this field in the middle. Field, we did a bit of soil analysis, nice brown earth, quite sandy brown earth actually. It's also on a bit of a hilltop. Hexham is, you know, in the centre of the country on that sort of Pennine chain, enough rainfall that it's not going to be limiting. And it gave us a bit of a headache, this site, because we thought, well, how are we going to go and cultivate it? Do we need to cultivate the site? And we thought, well, you know, maybe we should go for sort of continuous mounding or maybe just ripping. And we weren't sure. What did happen though was also interesting is that when the grazier came off in late summer, it came off early in July, and suddenly that site, which had been a nice green field, turned into a mass of thistles. Within the space of a month, there was vegetation about waist high, and we suddenly realised there was going to be a weed problem there. And again, we weren't able at that stage to address it, so we ended up topping it and hoping maybe the thistles would grow back. Then we could actually put a selected herbicide onto it. That didn't happen. So we knew we were going to have a problem with thistles and other vegetation later on. And then for some reason, we decided to go down with the mounder, and perhaps partly we're thinking about if there's going to be a lot of high vegetation, at least if we've got mounds on the ground, we can see them and we know where to weed. So we did that. We put the mounder in. We then asked the planting contractor to apply a selected herbicide, propazamide, which is long lasting, before planting. Unfortunately, the planting contractor had his own thoughts on the matter and planted it before applying the herbicide. And that wasn't a good idea. We were not happy with him. He then ended up doing some herbicide late and ended up just using glyphosate as opposed to something which is long lasting like propazamide. And suddenly we're in trouble. And then if you remember last spring, extremely dry for 3 months. We planted Douglas fir, the right tree for this site, but extremely susceptible to drought. And these mounds dried out pretty quickly. It's fairly sandy soil. And the losses were very substantial, probably over 50% losses. And we were also concerned we might have had a bit of herbicide. So we had a real problem. Then it started to rain in the middle of the summer and the site became very weedy. The thistles were suddenly, nearly neck high, and we hardly see the trees. And we had a major problem on that site. And I come back to my epiphany. So what I've decided this year, we did get some weeding done, and we actually planted this site in August. I think I mentioned this idea of planting Douglas fir earlier on in the talks. So we did the planting, and the trees are looking okay. They're looking green, the buds are looking good. But what I've been doing this weekend is sitting on a quad bike applying herbicide from a boom sprayer. And it's an interesting exercise to sit on a quad bike and drive between mounds, because I've learned something very important. I've learned that we actually decided to plant at quite high density, about 3,000 trees per hectare. So that means planting it 2 meters in the road, but squeezing the rows together. Now, the only reason we did that is because of the grants. The more trees you plant under the grant rules, the more money you get. But it means driving down between those becomes an extremely bumpy and painful experience. I also had the idea that I might be mowing between those rows this summer with a quad mounted mower. And that's probably not going to be possible. So some of that mechanization that we were hoping to get, which I think is vital, and I go back to the idea that if we're going to plant 30,000 hectares of trees a year, that's a big step change for planters and the contracting industry. You know, the contracting industry is struggling to plant the trees they're doing at the moment. But if we're going to plant a lot more, we have to think about getting more operations mechanized and being able to do actually sort of weeding and maintenance from quad bikes and tractors. And you've got to plan your ground cultivation to allow that. So I've just found that what we've done on that site really is a hindrance. I also discovered that mounding contractors, when they come to the end of the rows, leave a fairly ragged edge. Nothing wrong with that. But what they do, and I've watched them this year, is that they need, when a tractor comes to the end of the rows, they need about 6 to 8 meters to turn round. So they lift the mounders up early, turn round, and at the very last thing, they then do a parallel row right across the end of the mounds. Well, that becomes a minefield for a quad bike as well. So I'll be making sure that in the end, the instructions say, if you're going to do this mounding or whatever, just keep it in one direction and keep it simple so that you can actually get mechanized operations. And it's also interesting that you just spend some time looking at the quality of the work, to see how variable the spacing is. And that's a difficult thing to do. And it's a difficult thing to do for a mounding operation, but it also is a difficult thing for a planting contractor to do if he hasn't got any cultivation. And I don't think you cannot underestimate, if you're planting certainly conifers or broadleaves in large quantities for quality, where you need regular rows and high density of trees, it is absolutely vital to spend a lot of time thinking about how you physically set out that site and how you physically manage it. So my lesson from that site is, I wish I'd probably gone with my initial idea of ripping the site. And ripping the site at the same time, a ripper goes in there, and again, you'll see some of the photographs on the slides. But you can also attach a herbicide application, so you can do ripping and herbicide application at the same time. And that would have prepared the site in advance, given good weed control, and would have been probably much easier to carry out sort of mowing and weeding on a fertile site for the future. So that was my lesson from last weekend. And I think it just illustrates is that you've got to try to think of all aspects. It's not just about soil. It's not just about that decision matrix about what causes the. It's about how you can manage that site best for the future of your trees. And again, maybe that idea, maybe we did get it wrong with mounding when we get dry sites, is that maybe direct planting or using something like a ripper, which gives you a ripping line to plant against, it possibly would have made it less resistant to the drought that we saw last year. So that's my experience from this week. And I think it just shows two examples about how you think you've got things right, and yet site conditions might be different. So take the time, if you've got the luxury, to know your site right across the year before you plant it. It's probably a luxury a lot of private foresters aren't going to get, but try to think about those wider contexts. Okay, so I think that already sets the scene. And I think we can probably go over to look at Q&A and just look at some of the sort of practicalities. So don't be afraid to ask any questions about the sort of machinery that's available, what they're trying to do, and what the costs of it are. It's your chance to sort of ask any questions you want to. Okay.
That was a real life tangible example of the potential complexity of this. Thank you, Dave. And I'll just highlight the Menti link in the chat. So if you do have questions, then feel free to add it to the Menti link, use the chat, or raise your hand, or failing that, just unmute yourself. Let's talk about money first, shall we? Always a good place to start. Where can we find up-to-date costs for different operations?
Not easy. I am aware that the Forestry Commission, as part of the new grant scheme they're going to launch in the summer, are carrying out an exercise to look at standard costs. And that will probably be part of the new grant scheme model. And that will give a reasonable guidance. And again, we're not quite sure how the new grant scheme might look, but there may be some extra funding based on the standard cost for different operations. So as a guide, I would say that you can look at operations like ploughing, continuous mounding, and scarification being very similar operations with very similar costs today. Basically, they're tractor mounted trailed implements. The tractor will move across the site at about the same pace for all of those operations. Scarification might be a little bit slower. And generally they're costing, with this is a direct contractor cost around about £250 a hectare to £300 a hectare on a fairly standard site with reasonable access. You've got the operations which are then going to be excavator mounted, and the cost of these will depend on what you're trying to do, and again the density of trees that you're planting. But if we say that when you're using an excavator, you're planting 1,600 mounds per hectare for broadleaves and 2,500 mounds per hectare for conifers, then the costs are going to be around about £450 to £550 per hectare, something in that order. And then things like rippers and mole plows, which are essentially just a single implement behind a tractor, which are going to be quicker and faster, perhaps half the price of mounding. So it's not easy to find those, but one of the things you're going to have to think about again is what contractors are available in your particular location, what equipment they've got. And there's not a great deal of choice. Generally, as I said earlier, there's perhaps in the north of Scotland and the north of England, maybe 6 contractors in total doing the whole of the ground preparation. And they've all got similar equipment, and they all know each other, and they all price very similar. Again, if you're unsure about an operation, you've got a significant operation, find as many possible, and go out to tender. Tendering is always a good thing to do. You don't need to do it all the time. You know, ultimately, it's good to have a relationship with a contractor you trust and who are going to be able to help you. But occasionally, especially for larger jobs, I would certainly say go and tender and get the prices and use that. And again, bear in mind, perhaps the cheapest price might not always be the best, and be particularly wary of people who are new to the operation. Okay, I think I'll leave it there for now.
I think, could I just ask one kind of supplementary question to that, and also just point to the slides within the training module? So there's certainly one, if not two slides within the module that indicate the range and spread of the cost of those interventions. So it indicates which are the cheapest, which is the most expensive. And just a question, Dave, I think the published FC standard costs, which are really quite rusty now, the old ones, I don't think they include ground preparation techniques, do they? Because they're still available on the FC website, aren't they, I think?
You've got me there. I haven't seen them for a long time. Yeah. But again, this is, I'm presuming that these are going to be a part of the grant scheme and going to be included. Yeah. I'm just looking at that slide on the second part of the module, finding a balanced solution, which you can see that plough, it's showing, you know, cost as being a single furrow ploughing being the lowest costable moldboard ploughing, moving to trench mounding and inverted mounding being the case, which largely follows what I said. Really, again, if anything that can be pulled behind a tractor is going to be cheaper than using an excavator, but it's not always the right thing. And again, something which perhaps isn't covered in the slides, and that is on wet sites, flat wet sites. Drainage is you're going to need a very intensive drainage network. And you should bear in mind, and it's interesting, when I was lecturing, and we used to get the students to go and dig soil pits at distances away from a sort of main V drain. And what is very interesting is V drainage is very effective at catching surface water, but does nothing for groundwater. And, you know, if these are going to be 50 meters apart and that's your only drainage, it'll have very little impact on groundwater. So something like ditch and dolloping, where you've got quite an intensive network of V drains, maybe every 16 meters apart, might be a very effective way, but probably the most expensive way of dealing with sort of heavy, wet clay soils. So it's, you know, I think cost is not that significant, even at the more expensive end of it, when it comes to cultivation. Use the right cultivation rather than trying to find the cheapest solution. Maybe again, just to illustrate, our main planting contractor rang me up again last week and says he's been approached by a forestry company to see if he actually owns a planting machine, because they've been looking at this guidance and think, well, actually, this guidance suggests we don't need to be doing cultivation. What we need is a planting machine, because that's the cheapest way of getting the job done. Well, it's interesting. I think there's only one planting machine left in the country. They were quite popular 20 years ago. And it's interesting that there's only one of them left, and it's rusting in a contractor's yard somewhere. But bear in mind, the quality of the planting isn't very good. So you'll get no ground cultivation on some poor sites, and you could actually make some serious problems. Neville and I are probably both aware of two major sites which were planted in the late 90s with a planting machine in West Cumbria on reclaimed land. All very cost effective, was able to actually do herbicide application at the same time, but they managed to kill 90% of their trees with that herbicide. That company went out of business. So, you know, precautionary tail, cheap. You know, if you're going to go to the cheapest option, it possibly isn't the right solution.
Should we stick with the money side of things? And Dave has posted something in the chat. Dave, if you'd like to unmute yourself and show your face, then if you could vocalize that question, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Dave.
Yeah.
How you doing?
Excellent. Out and about. Good to see.
Yeah, multitasking. Yeah, just interesting, really. As you say, I'm Shropshire based, and there's a few contractors based around here, and not many of them that I know of offer any maintenance once the trees have been planted. So yeah, just for quite a while I've been looking into that, and I just wondered if you had an idea of price, you know, for a one-man quad bike, either spot spraying or a boom spray.
Well, I can tell you exactly, because I've just put the invoice for the work I did.
Fair play.
And it's interesting. Again, I was looking at that. I was looking, because we do use a contractor up in Scotland, Laurent Beyond Fair, who's been using a quad bike and boom sprayer for a while, and he's been charging about £60 to £70 a hectare for the actual quad bike and sprayer, and then the chemical on top. Which again, depending what you're using, I noticed that Kirby's in short supply and quite expensive this year, and that's working out probably about another £30 to £40 a hectare with the chemical. So yeah, I would have said if you're doing herbicide with a quad mounted sprayer, probably about £100 to £120 a hectare. It's certainly at the start of the job. Doing it in the second year is harder. So again, think about how you set these things out, and it all comes down to, I've now learned at my cost that trying to go through even through a mounded site on a tight mount is difficult. If you've been ripping there, it'd be a lot quicker and a lot smoother. And again, I think contractors are going to have to think quite innovatively about how to do herbicide operations. And if you can get, maybe a high ground clearance tractor with a bigger boom, you might be able to do this much more effectively. And I think this will be possibly a growth area for contractors and maintenance contractors, because it can be a major problem. I'm very much aware that our planting contractors like to plant trees and do not like to spray. And these days, they're certainly in the north of the country are planting right the way through June, even into July, and then starting again at the end of September, which leaves a very short window for maintenance. So there's the forestry sector, if you're going to gear up to a lot more woodland creation of bigger projects, it's going to have to find a very effective way of doing maintenance. So it's something to work on, and I think we've got to put our heads together and come up with good solutions. And but go this thinking and going thinking using the right ground preparation, which will facilitate that, is going to be important. Yeah, maybe something to think about is that we for years we've got hung up on the idea that we planted 2 meters by 2 meters spacing. And machines have largely done that. Maybe we need to actually think about having rows 2.2 meters apart, and the spacing down the rows maybe a little bit tighter to get the sort of density. But that's sort of practical sort of issues we need to think about. Same is true for native woodland. We very much want to have a site which is going to be very random spacing, and we tend not to use so much herbicide there. But if the sites are going to be more fertile and bigger, again, we need to maybe make some compromises from making it look semi-natural and to be able to actually manage it and maintain it and get it to grow.
Yeah. Just want to say as well, I found the whole tutorial really refreshing, to be honest, and yeah, cracking job.
Good, thank you, Dave.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you.
It's the Dave Appreciation Society, Mutual Dave. Thanks ever so much, Dave. I'll come to Mark, who's posted a question in the chat next. Mark, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, Dave. It's a question about Operation Note 53, which seems to be being enforced quite strongly. This is about moving over strongly to mound planting rather than ploughing. And I was just wondering what your take on it is. It seems there's a split down the forestry industry as to whether this is the way forward or not, but obviously it's coming from headquarters now. So I was interested in your take on it.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of implicit, particularly if you're looking through those slides, when you go to look at the decision matrices, very much are pushing you toward no cultivation or mounding. And in fact, actually, you can see that in no such scenario is ploughing recommended. And I think it's a mistake, because I think the document itself is pretty good. I just think the conclusions in the decision matrix are wrong. And I think that's something that the industry will be taking up with the Forestry Commission, because it's certainly the case that on wet, deep glaze, the idea that you can actually direct plant, if you're going to, you can't direct plant anything and expect it to grow on a wet, deep blade. It's just a pointless exercise. The recommendation that you should be using inversion mounding, absolutely fine for native woodland, not fine for planting a productive crop of trees. So really, you really ought to be looking at more, you need to have to consider ploughing as a viable option. And I think the forest industry will tell the Forest Commission that ploughing is the most viable option on heavy wet clay soils. You've got to be careful, but you need to, you need to do it well. So yeah, I think the guidance has been probably rushed a little bit, and it will need some time to bed in. And I would hope that the Forest Commission and woodland officers would be flexible and listen, because actually, if within the guidance, I think some of the text suggests that you've got to make a strong case for ploughing. So I think as long as people are allowed to do that and justify that, and don't slavishly follow the matrix, which I think is probably the only thing wrong with the guidance, I think there should be scope in there to have proper, argued and reasoned decisions in there. So it needs a little bit of time to bed in, and I would hope there it could be refined as we learn from new cases coming forward.
Great, thanks for that.
I'm going to come back on that, but I wonder whether it's worth Carrie just getting the decision matrix up so that we can have a quick look at that actually by share screening that. That would be brilliant, Carrie, if you could. Thank you. Before we look at that, I'd also just like to say that's great. So we'll maybe talk about that, but I'd just like to talk about ploughing and ploughing. So I recall a conversation recently, Dave, in preparation for this, where there was discussion about what we mean by ploughing, and that seems to be quite an important distinction for me that I don't think was drawn out in the last couple of minutes.
It is, and I think it comes down to what constitutes deep ploughing and what is shallow ploughing. And again, in the guidance, it's again slightly ambiguous, because it's in some areas it's suggesting that 45 centimeters and above is deep ploughing, and 45 centimeters and less is not deep ploughing. And then it talks about shallow ploughing being about 30 centimeters or less. So there's a little bit, it's not quite clear if it's 40, 45 or 30 centimeters. What I would say is most forestry ploughs available today will be ploughing at 45 to 30 centimeters, and they can be adjusted by the operator. There's certainly not going to be going down to 60 centimeters and 90 centimeters, which were very much specialist ploughs designed for deep peat in the past, and we're not doing that. So, the double moldboard ploughs, which is the standard plough for agriculture as well. You're not going to find. We talk about single furrow ploughing. Well, you're not going to find one of them, and it's highly inefficient and in fact quite disruptive as well. So it comes down to what this depth is, and again, the Forest Commission are probably going to have to take look at this a little bit more on the ground, talk to contractors, see what's available and what it's actually achieving. But certainly the standard plough is in that 30 to 45 centimeter range, and again, I think that is seen as being acceptable on the right soils. It's not acceptable to go and run it down steep hillsides with 200 meter long runs in high rainfall areas. You're going to get a disaster. That's poor planning. But on wet sticky sites, which are going to be a little bit flatter, that probably is acceptable. So again, there's a sort of an understanding which has got to be built up between the Forest Commission and the industry when it comes to ploughing. And again, ploughing is, if you're going to use ploughing, it's going to be for certain soil types and certain locations. The majority of sites in England, they're probably not going to need it, but there will be sites where I think the forest industry still thinks it's a viable tool.
Now, as everything is, in most cases, it's about interpretation rather than black and white, isn't it? And it's about presenting a case. Is there anything, just looking at this matrix, I think the basis of the matrix seems really good to me in the fact that, it's indicating the levels of intensity and the potential options that are out there. What you're debating is the actual enactment of this, and perhaps a little bit more nuanced around what should be allowed or what should get 1 star or 2 stars, isn't it, Dave?
It is, and especially if you look in that bottom right-hand corner, which is where you've got sort of wet soils and what it calls higher intensity, where ploughing comes into it, then you can see that there's no ticks there. And certainly, there's only 1 tick for some of those things. So I'm a little concerned that it's that matrix, perhaps if it's taken literally, is a little bit concerning. And again, you can look at the top left-hand corner where you've got your brown earths and things, and you can see that, you know, it's suggesting that no cultivation or just patch scarification might be a good thing to do. You know, my experience, again, it comes to this sort of practicality of laying out sort of planting where you need some cultivation, even if it's a rip line, which is going to help planters and help your herbicide operations and get things laid out. Do not underestimate how important that is. It's not about drainage, it's often just about laying out a site. And it's those practicalities which I think that matrix is just missing there. And you know, I'd be concerned if that was slavishly followed, because I think a lot of the text within the guidance document is good and sound, but sometimes people often jump to the decision matrix at the end. And I do worry sometimes about decision support tools like ESC and decision matrices, because it's providing an answer without having to go through the thought process, or it's a black box, and the thought process is somebody else's, which is lost from view. I think it's important that every forester thinks out all the issues and makes their case and makes the case stronger.
So I had the perfect example of that yesterday, and I'm not going to name who it was, but they I was in a meeting with somebody, and the forester I was working with had used ESC to come up with some suggestions, but then was quizzed quite hard by the client on a number of occasions, but was able to fall back on his knowledge and understanding of the species to back up and strengthen the line that had come out by ESC. And I thought it was that perfect balance of both knowing the stuff and using the decision support tools to come up with some challenge, some different thinking perhaps, and just to illustrate to the client a couple of different ways that you've come to that species selection. I thought it was excellent. Can I ask a question before we, I'll just keep this one slide up briefly, and then we'll go back to the questions on Menti. Dave, I'm interested in inverted mounding. It's something that I've seen very little of, but seems to me, just from that point of view of gardening, of improving soil structure, reducing competition, etc. I mean, have you used it much? Do you rate it as a technique? And would you even think about using it for some of the brown earths up in that top left-hand corner?
Probably not for brown earths. I think it's a good tool on wetter sites. Very, very good tool for sort of heavy wet glaze for native woodland, where you're planting sort of alder, willow, aspen, something like a wet, sticky sites, where you need a raised planting position. One of the great advantages over just sort of hinge mounding is if you've got a big bucket and you throw it back in there, it's surprisingly how you still get a mound. You think it would just slot back in there, but it sort of sticks up, but it's big and heavy. It's more stable as well, especially if you're going to use 1.2 meter shelters in it, because they will just simply blow over on a standard mound. So I think it's a very good tool for native woodland. An excavator is far superior to a continuous mounder because you can get varied spacing, you can make it look natural. You can, and again, if as opposed to just hinge mounding, which is a bit easier and a bit cheaper, you don't get this pool of water. Even from a selfish point of view, it means the forester isn't falling into it as they're walking over the site in the summer. Very good tool. I've got a site we did 2 years ago in Estill in West Cumbria. Again, very flat site where we used intensive drainage and then actually did a network of ground preparation with inverted mounders. And the mounding contractor very, very careful, did a very tidy job of putting these things in rows for us as well. And again, that was a bit more costly, but a very, very good job with some intensive drainage on that side. So we use it quite a lot, and a very, very good tool.
Excellent, thank you. I'll come to a question from Simon Mascari. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. Simon, if you want to unmute yourself, it carries on about the inverted mounding, and then we'll come back to Robin, who had a question about ploughing.
Hi, yeah, just following up on the comment about inverted mounding being okay for native woodland but not for productive forest, and I'm just wondering why that is, and whether it was just to do with the tree species being better suited to the site and able to grow without the need for the ground prep, or what the reason for that was.
Well, I think I did say we have done one example. I wouldn't use it as a standard thing because it is a slow operation and it's tricky to organise and quite costly. And again, even hinge mount, again, it's idea if you're going to do hinge mounding, it's again, what are you trying to achieve? And if it's a wet site, you're going to need a fairly intensive drainage network. So I think ploughing gives you integral drainage, or you need a sort of ditch and dolloper type thing whereby you're actually creating an intensive network of drainage. So it's what are you trying to achieve with your ground preparation? So I think that's the main thing. So I wouldn't rule it out. And as I said, in one particular example, we've actually used it where we were creating, quite an awkward site, and it was a wet site, and we didn't want to get those sort of pools after that with an intensive drainage network. So it's really think about what you're trying to achieve. I would say that probably if it's wet and sticky, ploughing is going to give the results you want better than mounding. Then probably think ditch and dolloping. Or if you're not allowed to do that, maybe you have to think you maybe chosen the wrong site to try to actually grow productive conifers or productive broadleaves. Okay,
thanks ever so much, Simon. Claire Carey, if I can ask you to go back to the question, then I'll come to Robin while we're doing that. Robin, if you can unmute yourself and perhaps show your face as well.
Yeah, thanks, Neville. Yeah, just looking at the talk of moldboarding, and I just have to say I'm pretty new to this. That's a new phrase to me, and I don't know if you can actually just tell us what it involved and why it's frowned upon now.
So a moldboard, essentially a double moldboard plough, it's just essentially a standard sort of agricultural plough, but basically creates a sort of a furrow, and it throws the soil out on both sides, and they end up at 2 meter spacing. So I think there is some videos of the ploughing, so have a look at that. That shows it in action, and and there's the images showing the result. But it's a standard sort of term in sort of all ploughing, agricultural ploughing. It's the moldboard is the actual shape of the furrow that's thrown out. It's frowned upon for some of it's probably its historical sort of connections with deep ploughing of extensive deep peats, particularly in the north of Scotland, where you were talking peats of meters and meters of depth, and they were using very deep ploughing up to 90 centimeters, even deeper in times, and ditches up to about 1 meter depth to try to completely change the peat and dry the peat out, and it never worked. So that was, that really was probably the peak of forestry trying to conquer sites. As I say, what we're doing today is very unlikely that we're going to be on peats, or peats are probably going to be in a matter of centimeters, and then we definitely have to have no real peat vegetation prior to having to associate it with it. So ploughing is still, to my mind, is still allowable, and I think it's still allowable under the guidance. The main reason it's been frowned upon, and probably is being shown as not being seen as the main choice, is that there is this link to carbon, and the research and the guidance suggests that there's going to be a greater release of carbon. I have to say again, if you've not read the summaries which are on the website about carbon, which suggests that the losses from soil cultivation are actually very low, and far lower than the growth of the trees in the long run. But there will be a short-term release of carbon. And I suppose it's a slight, that's the justification for much of this sort of thing at the moment, is that we're just trying to minimize carbon loss at wherever we can. The question must be, would ploughing actually allow you to get more growth and more carbon sequestered in the future? And again, somebody just sent me a couple of papers from Sweden, which again certainly support that view. That the research in Sweden, when they've looked at that, has found that ploughing actually increased growth and carbon sequestration in the long term. So I'll pass them on to Neville, and they can be put up into the mix for people who want to learn it, because this is quite an active debate, and I think I think foresters need to engage with it.
Just also, I was interested in these the planting machines, because I remember those 20 years ago, they were going to be actually used on quite a number of sites, and I remember them. And it's interesting you're saying that they've just not, you know, they're not being used at the moment. I mean, if we're looking at 30,000 hectares a year, and, you know, we're looking at a vastly increasing woodland creation, unless we're going to sort of have a massive workforce, you'd think that somehow those machines would be actually coming into their own now. So it's interesting that you're saying that they seem to have been a passing fad, if you like. Don't know if you want to comment on that, Dave. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and they were very much a fashion. I know that I used to work at Till Hill. Till Hill were running machines, specifically in the northeast of Scotland, on improved land and arable land. There's a lot of planting, and they were very, very popular. They were cheap. They were seen as being cheap, getting herbicide done at the same time as planting. It was a cheaper operation, a one-pass operation. And I think there will be. I think we'll see them again. But you've got to bear in mind that, you know, it is a horrendous job. You know, two people sat in a tarpaulin covered thing, dragged behind a tractor, bouncing along through stones, shoving trees into a wheel, staring at the ground. You know, I don't think that we really want to be encouraging that.
No.
You know, I see modern planters and they're fit young people who can make money, and you know, I'd like to see more of that. I think, you know, it's a grim job, and I'm not sure I would really want to see that coming back. And again, we were talking through the economics with the contractor. The contractor was good. Was trying to search. In fact, he went over and picked it up, and he was going to give it a little trial to see how it went. But even when you looked at the cost of that, it was barely cheaper than manual planting.
Right.
So
interesting.
And again, I just like I said, we know of a couple of examples where I think the problem was more the herbicide that was used, which was notorious on wet soils, which isn't available now. I think that's why there was massive mortality on those two sites. But it is a risky thing.
Okay, right. Thanks, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Robin. I'll come to Carrie next. I think you've got a question about ploughing.
This is actually, it's kind of a comment to carry on from the matrix, and where we're looking at the very, very wet areas in the bottom corner. Because in module 6, I did a case study, which you will all see in the next part of the course, which looked at very wet but very soft sites. I know, Dave, you're talking about very wet, sticky sites. Wet, soft sites were actually, in the conversations I was having, and this is over in Galloway forest area, in the south region of Scotland, when they have put ploughs across those sites, actually the ploughs have sank because they're going back and forward over the same sites multiple times. And they find that trench mounding on the flat, softest sites is the best way to go forward. And they're very, very wet sites. So I just thought I'd put that comment in there because it is location based. All of this is very nuanced. You can't come to any decision without understanding your site, your area, and what works best there. So, yeah.
Great, thanks, Carrie. Claire, if I could just get you to scroll back up. I think we've answered that question in the bottom left last. There's one here about some of the recommendations in the FC guidance document seem to be at odds with problems you might encounter for each soil type. Are the recommendations correct? E.g., inverted mounding or null cultivation is the most appropriate method of. And I'm not sure whether we've kicked that around enough yet, Dave. Is there anything else that you would add to that?
Yeah, I think we've kind of covered that it comes back to that, you know, looking at the decision matrix there, which I think we've already, shown there's some things there which probably need are open to interpretation and need a little bit more consideration. And as Carrie's point making, and I think with the example I started with, is that you have some very wet sites. You just simply, you're not going to be traveling on those sites, no matter what you think you want to do. Is you've got to work with what you've got. I think we probably covered that one well.
Okay, cool. So I think we're coming to the last question I can currently see, which is fine. That probably takes us to about time. If you found an issue, like an area of deep peat while cultivating a site, how much flexibility is there in typical funding, e.g. FC Woodland Creation grant offer to alter plans? And a separate question really, but linked to that, and can we rely on the operator to raise these types of issues?
I think this probably brings us to the dreaded barrier end, which is it was a live example of a site that was planted last spring with the England Woodland Grant Scheme, or Countryside Stewardship Woodland Creation Grant Scheme. And then it was made that hit the news and been on the national news because it suddenly discovered that they'd ploughed an area of peat. I can't remember. I think the site was about 30 hectares, and I believe there's been about 2 hectares of which you would probably call deep peat. That was ploughed, and the grant was paid on it. Often the grants are paid without inspection, and it's interesting that in England they don't seem to have any recourse to reclaim that money, whereas if you did that in Scotland, they wouldn't pay you. That would be instantly out of the scheme. The onus in Scotland is for you to make sure with your soil surveys and all the work you do and the planning you do there to make sure that it meets the guidelines. So if you suddenly start to plow, you've missed it and it turns up, then you wouldn't be paid and you'd be made to actually put it right. That's something I think that approach really should apply in England as well. You do the groundwork, you do the soil testing, you find out if there's peats, and you make it. Now, if you come across a pocket of peat in 70 hectares and it's 5 meters wide, and you do find this, and I've got a site, an 80 hectare site we did about 33 years ago, and there's a few tiny little pockets of peat which have turned up. I think it would be fairly reasonable to say, well, you couldn't be expected to have found a pocket of peat 5 meters by 5 meters in 70 hectares. That's just, that's natural variability. Plus, you can, it's not really a continuous piece of habitat which is going to be viable. So I think that sort of flexibility. But if you're suddenly coming up to half a hectare, 1 hectare, 2 hectares, then you've made a mistake. You've made a mistake, and you're going to have to put it right. Should the contractors be able to spot that? Yes, you would hope a contractor would spot that. But again, coming back to, I know the contractor did Barrier End, and I know the operator. The operator is an inexperienced operator. We've been doing ground cultivation for less than probably a season. Good practical lad, but he was following a map and a GPS, and that's what he was doing. He probably wouldn't realise the subtleties of what's required in terms of the ground. He would realise that he's created cloud forests which are full of water and they look quite peaty. But it's not the operator to get it right; it's the forest manager to get that right in all the preparation work.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So I'll come to Mark in a second. My main message from that is Scotland's just better, really. Okay, Mark, over to you.
Yeah, it's just a comment because I'm on the FWAC of the Northeast and I challenged what was going on with Barrier End, and unfortunately part of it was a victim of COVID because the research had to be done on desktop from the Forestry Commission end of it, so nobody actually got out on site to visit it, and on Magic Maps it wasn't indicating the right terrain, and so that was why it was the error. So at that point we did actually rely on local knowledge and local people who were on the site where that information should have come through, but that's how it got through the system, embarrassingly.
Dave, you want to come back on that? Thanks ever so much, Mark.
Again, really, when it comes to soil, we don't need to have, there isn't a resource which will tell you what your soil types are. And I've not been on the site, but I've driven past the site, and it's fairly obvious that I think a forester would be able to identify the site and should be able to identify the soil. One of the problems with the grant scheme process and the whole EIA determination process is it tends to be a little bit adversarial, and it means that it doesn't really encourage a manager to put forward his best proposal at the start. And I've had this, whereby you think, well, I'm going to lose that through there, but then suddenly, Forestry Commission don't walk the site, Natural England don't look at the site, and suddenly those proposals which you never expected to get are suddenly turned into a grant contract. So I think that's something for the process and for all parties to work out, and perhaps if everybody approaches things much more openly, that the idea that the forester can put forward what they think is their best, what they think their best scheme is, and then not expect to see that as a starting point which is going to be eroded. That might see better decisions being made, and again, talking to the people involved at Barrier, I think there's an element of that. I think they probably expected the Forestry Commission to have walked the site, and Natural England to have walked the site, and to maybe have argued for a reduction in the area, which never came. So that's you know, that's a change in attitude from all parties, really, but which leads to an error, really.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm not seeing any more questions either coming up in Menti through the chat or anybody waving their hands. I'll just go, if anybody does have a question, then please just raise your hand now and I'll go for radio silence, just speak out. If you don't, then we'll move to a close because we're pretty sweet on time. Cool. There's just to highlight to people, there's a tool just come up in the chat, landis.org soilscapes. Somebody else concurring that that's really useful. Okay, so I'm not hearing anybody else, so what I'll do is I'll bring this session to a close. I just thought it was a really good discussion, really good debate, lively debate about very current, very contentious topics. I mean, to me, it comes down to knowledge, interpretation, and professionalism. And that has to be a good thing. It makes it an interesting place to work. It makes it a place where you're valued, your knowledge is valued, and then there is the best for you and the best for society and the best for the sector. So, you know, I think you're taking that really important first step by upskilling yourself, engaging in the discussion, engaging in the debate. And now it's about carrying on with that in practice, joining next week's session, and fingers crossed, some of the future sessions will be running on this stuff around things like soil sampling, etc. So I'll move to a close. I'll say thank you again, Dave. Thanks ever so much to Carrie for preparing the materials. I'd also need to thank our sponsors once more. That's Forest Services, Forestry Commission, and Roots to Prosperity. Highlight that the final module is next week, so I look forward to seeing you all next week. Your homework is up on the website now, I believe. If it's not there now, then it will be certainly tomorrow. Before I say cheerio, have I forgotten anything? Claire, Carrie, are we putting up a slide, another slide for how we did today? Oh yeah, thank you. So if you can vote on that, then that would be useful. Is the link the same one? The link in the chat for this one, Claire? Excellent, thank you. So with that, I'll say, please do vote. Really good to see you all. Thanks ever so much for your questions and comments. See you all next week. Thanks a lot, Dave. I think we should stick with those results. 100% of people that voted said that you're close the poll now. Looks like we might be having problems with the link. Oh, even better. Still at 100%.
Yes, sorry, for some people that link isn't working, for others it is. We'll work out why.
Don't worry, Carrie. Thanks ever so much for trying, everybody. If it's not working, then feel free to either send us an email or we'll just pick it up next week. So handouts are PDFs. If you would like a PDF, Mark, or anybody else of the modules, then just drop us a line. And so probably best to go to claire@cumbriawoodlands.co.uk and she can send out PDFs. And also just to point out that we can send out recordings of the sessions as well.